thank you all so much for joining us. Many of you for the second time, even though I know we are all continuing to deal with a great deal of uncertainty globally, but also in your own jobs and homes. I'm also going to quickly just mute everyone just so that we can all hear. All right. So I'm Nellie Mecklenburg. I'm from the Institute for State Effectiveness. I was on the call last time, so hopefully this is a reintroduction for many. I'll be co-facilitating this call along with John Coonrod, who I'm sure many of you know. He is the co-founder of the movement and also the executive vice president of the Hunger Project. I also wanted to acknowledge Gunjan Veda from the movement, who was super integral in organizing this call and is also with us today. As many of you are already doing, if you don't mind, we're not going to have time to do a round of introductions for everyone, but if you could just type in your names and organization and where you're dialing from into the chat box, that would be great. As I think all of you should know, this call is a follow-on from one we held in April on the 21st, where we examined different challenges presented by COVID and started to brainstorm some ways that we could potentially resume some of our regular programming, regular CLD programming, despite the restrictions and physical distancing policies, excuse me, that have been instituted in many, many parts of the world. But before we dive in any further, I'm just going to go over a couple of tips and some ground rules. This will be familiar again to those who were with us last time. So the first thing is that we had incredible participation despite having 100 people on the call last time. We hope and expect that if you have come back for a second time that you are even more eager to engage. So this call entirely depends on all of your brilliant ideas and active participation. As before, there's no such thing as an idea that's too bold or one that isn't totally perfectly formulated yet. This is a brainstorming. So I'm really looking forward to that. And this should be a smaller group than last time, so there'll be even more time for conversation. As John mentioned to those who were here a bit early, we are recording the session. We'll again share the recording after the call. The recording from the April call is up on the movement website, as is a summary of the last call and a draft reflections paper that hopefully you all received yesterday. Excuse me. We will at times put everyone on mute just to make sure that we can hear from everyone. But if you're going to speak, you can just unmute yourself with the little button that looks like a microphone. Once you are done talking, please just mute yourself again. Also, if you speak, it would be great if you can again just introduce yourself and what your organization is, excuse me, what your organization is and your name. We will, in order, again, it's a lot of people on the call, so to make sure that we aren't all speaking on top of each other, if you'd like to speak, you can click the raise hand button, which will be right under the participant list. And Anne Hendricks-Jenkins will be monitoring that for all of us. You can alternatively just type in a comment directly into the chat box. That will be where a lot of our conversation will be happening. And again, Anne will be following that and making sure that all of your voices are heard. So those are the important functions of Zoom: the mute button, the chat box, and the raise hand. Last time we had this call, we were very fortunate with technology, but I won't hold my breath that we won't have any glitches this time. So please just, have your patience and good humor in case anything arises. So before we really dive in, I'm just going to do a really quick poll to see where everybody is calling in from. Hopefully you are seeing that on your screens now. If you're not, someone just give me a heads up. I see we have a couple of responses already coming in. I'll just give a couple of seconds for you all to do that. I see we have calls from Asia, Africa, North America, South Africa, So far, nobody from Europe, and not surprisingly, nobody from Australia, because it's the middle of the night there. Okay, so while that keeps going, I'll just introduce the purpose of today's call. So we're building on the conversation from April, and we're exploring how we can or should be adapting some of our regular CLD programming, particularly on facilitation, communication, training, community meetings. How can we adapt those kinds of processes so that we can keep up CLD programming, which is so important during this time, despite physical distancing, but despite lockdowns and shutdowns? We wanted to note that we say physical distancing, not social distancing, because as it was raised on the last call, and this time we actually need social solidarity a lot. So we don't want to be socially distant, just physically distant. Today, we're going to continue to brainstorm ideas from the last call. We're going to continue to think about adaptations that we have been using, but we're also going to think about how to prepare for the next 6 to 10 weeks, as in some places restrictions are easing. Just going to mute everyone one more time, excuse me. And then we're also going to think ahead into the future and the longer term, and what kinds of adaptations perhaps we should be thinking about generally for our programming in light of the experiences that we've been having. Today's call is an hour and a half. John, you can actually go to the next slide if you don't mind. We're going to very quickly hear some takeaways from April 21st. Then we're going to look at where we are now. We're going to have some polls and a brief conversation. We'll move right from there into breakout groups, which we had in the previous call and we'll come back to. Then we will reconvene. We'll hear a little report out from the different groups and have a discussion about the longer term adaptations. We'll start to discuss that. And then we'll close with next steps. So a very full agenda. Hopefully I'm staying on time. As we start, I wanted to ask Diana from the Hunger Project Mexico to quickly share with us some of the key takeaways from the call in April. This will be reflecting some of the ones from the piece that we sent out yesterday, but also obviously please feel free to add any that we may have missed. The reflections piece was a draft, and we really want to make sure that we get inputs from all of you and from the wider community, that it reflects what we're all thinking. As Diana speaks, if you have any other takeaways from the call that you want to mention, please type them in the chat box and Anne will keep track of that. So Diana, over to you. It'll just be a few minutes, and apologies in advance if we cut you off.
Okay, don't worry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. So as you know, I want to be very quickly on this. So on April 21, we have this phone call, and the summary of this brainstorm, since some of you might not be in there. So we have these 4 main challenges, 4 key barriers, and also brainstorm their main challenges at that moment. We have 4 questions for discussing during breakout groups, and I want to just talk about the summary of the brainstorm and the breakout groups. So the first barrier was access. So a very relevant challenge was the need to reach people with short or not access at all to internet or phone connectivity. And there were mentions of the inability to travel also. So in the breakout group, they came up with the relevance of neighborhoods connected to local governments. And we can use existing structures like community broadcast that now include COVID-19 information, for example. And also it was mentioned that we stand for social solidarity in the face of social distancing. So I think that's something that we really need to have focus on. The second barrier was convening. So since the physical distance measures, we're facing challenges for maintaining face-to-face work, and with the consequences in plans and projects. So for this one concern, of that is that people might not be too serious about COVID-19. And at the same time, there are experiences of new ways of engaging people and taking into account the build of a new normal, new ways of working with communities and to convene. And it is also a time for scaling up the recognition that local communities have the answer and solutions to their main challenges. The third barrier was procurement, and service delivery. So in this topic, the idea were around supply chain disruptions, shortages, closure of schools, government infrastructure, offices, and the concern is the lack of clarity of what is considered as essential services. And this is giving us also some questions around contractual obligations, payment and project grants, or supplies for community members, local staff, and teams. The fourth barrier is time or shifting priorities. And this is something really worried for us because the conversation identified the need to reprioritize responsibilities as a result of the pandemic. So the conversations of funders, investors, governments are focusing on COVID-19 response, and it's understandable, but we're losing spaces for women's voice and representation due to caregiving responsibilities. So we need to focus on this because the crisis is making more visible the inequalities around women, their lives, and the ways we participate and make decisions. There are particular documents of this group, so if you haven't had the opportunity to read them, you can go further in this. I just wanted to highlight some points. And I also wanted to have some takeaways on the Nelly and the Gonjan and Nelly document that I also hope you have the chance to read. So in this part, I would like to highlight some ideas because we were unprepared. Even though we said it's going to be a crisis because of climate change or any other, we were not prepared enough. And we have to plan out our work and alliances based on this. This is a finding and a challenge. Communities know best. The second highlight is that communities know best how to adapt programming to continue fulfilling their needs. And this is exactly how Gunjan and Nelly write it down. And this shows that the solutions must be the core of those emerging trends. And this highlights and emphasize that each answer must be differentiated, acknowledging its particularities. The third one is this time needs to be based on collaborations among CLD organizations. We need to strengthen communications and reboost the collaboration during this period for a joint response and for creating a community of support. The emerging challenges are going to require this from us as organizations. So the last one is the joint collaboration gives us the possibility for learning and using experiences from previous crisis times. So we have two amazing and very provocative questions in this paper, and I think we're going further on them later on. So how can CLD better integrate crisis response into regular programming? And the second one is, what does this experience tell us about how to make our work more community-led? So with this, I want to have finally and very quickly, so because I wanted to share with you that in Mexico, we're moving around how to use this moment for changing the context towards good governance, and we're working to change narratives towards post-pandemic view. So when I was reading this paper, it's pretty clear that we have a focus on community responses since we know they have the answers and solutions. And this is really a time for proving and improving self-reliance in communities, because we need to strengthen capacities for example, monitoring and evaluation, for example, and design, but we need to also design and implement systems with them. And this is a huge opportunity for gathering data, reconsidering evidence-based policy. And this data needs to fit the community, not only nonprofits or investors. Yeah. We also must,
jump in, Diana. I'm so sorry, but
don't worry.
I think that was a great segue into the conversation, and I very much hope that we continue discussing exactly those points going on. So it's a pause, not a cutting off. So we are actually going to do a couple of quick polls right now. Also, if anybody else has other takeaways from the April 21st call, again, please post them in the chat box and we'll make sure that they're recorded and integrated into that reflections piece. So I'm going to post these polls now. There are 4 questions and they will help us get a better sense of where our programming stands now, some 6, 8, in some places 10 or more weeks into this crisis. So here we go. Hopefully you can all see those. can give just a few minutes for everybody to answer these. Can people see them? I hope so. If you can't see them, I haven't seen any responses come in yet. Please just type into the chat box so I know to change it. Questions are, what have your community groups or leaders or representatives been doing over the past month? Have they had to pause practices? Have they had to shift all of their work towards COVID response? Have they been doing that on their own or with government? The second question is, oops, sorry. Are the lockdowns easing in the countries that you work in? Have they, halted? Are they becoming less? Are they not? I know some of you work in multiple countries. If the lockdowns are easing where you work, what is the status of your regular programming? Did you halt it or did you not? Are you able to start resuming your programming? And then the final question is on whether or not we should set up some working groups. This was something that we had begun to discuss on the last call and will also return to. Okay, so I see people are starting to respond to this. You guys can absolutely please continue responding to that. But in the meantime, I think I will hand over to John to tell us a little bit about what the movement is doing and where they are with their response to COVID. John?
Okay, yes.
There we go.
So, great. So some people are able to continue and so have come up with some really great innovations. So I'd like to hear from some of our the country chapters that have been able to carry on. And if you want to raise your hand and let us know, a lot of you have also been putting in your innovations onto our website. Remember, right on our homepage of our website is a form that you can click on and fill in and enter your innovations. So let me just first see if someone wants to raise their hand, and Anne is watching them so we can unmute you and hear from you about innovations that you're doing. Anyone?
Yes.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. John, I want to put from Nigeria, Women for Community-Led Development Chapter, Nigeria. So it's a pleasure being in this meeting today. I try to most activities that will be putting on here, and we know that COVID-19 is reality, but we're still finding our way through to penetrate in this program and to see how the government can be able to rely on us and they collaborate with us. But it seems that it is not easy because the government, the COS have been not recognized, and our meeting
Unfortunately,
Yeah, we're having.
Can you hear me?
We're not able to hear you. Perhaps your connection is bad.
Sorry.
So if you're, perhaps you can just type.
That means my mic has been having a problem. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're not able to hear you. Can if you can type your situation into the chat box, then we can share it with everyone. No, your mic is still not working. So could we hear from someone else?
Yes, this is Pascal.
Hi, Pascal.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. Yeah. I would like to share how we, as the Benin CLD chapter, we are dealing with in terms of response to COVID-19. First, we met with all the chapter members, and we discussed clearly what would be the possible activities that our CLD chapter could implement, and what would be the relevant action that we need to take. And we decide first to move to meet the committee in charge of the response at the national level. And that committee is led by the Ministry of Health. And we met with the General Secretariat of the Minister to explain that we admire the measure taken by the government, but one field is missing. And we as chapter, we are organized to take lead to implement that part, which is missing. And that part is how the community could be really involved in responding to COVID-19 challenge. And after that, we send a letter to the minister to explain how we could really be involved. And the first action we have planned is to make sure at the community level that the COVID-19 is real. Because in some communities, people don't believe that the COVID-19 is real. Because we don't have such disaster in communities, particularly in rural level, who can show at the community level what is COVID-19 in reality. That is the first.
Excuse me, Pascal.
Yeah.
Can I also ask, one of the things we wanted to focus on today was sort of your regular activities of the Hunger Project or of the other members of your movement.
Yeah.
What regular activities in terms of capacity building and leadership development have you been able to continue or not continue or adapt?
Yeah, I will shift to that now.
Okay, great.
Yes. The question was, what regular activities have community group council leader representative been able to continue or resume doing recently? I will mention awareness raising activity related to our epicenter strategy. Those activities can continue at the community level. This year training and all follow-up activities that can be led by the epicenter project officers and animators, those activities are continuing. And awareness raising to stop the spread out of the COVID-19 pandemic, those activities are continuing with the support of Hunger Projects teams. And the report I'm now sharing is made from consultation I have with my colleagues from Senegal, from Burkina Faso, and Benin as well. So let me mention this. And we have also the follow, please.
So they've been able to continue their regular programs because they've been led by local community animators, local community leaders.
Yes. And we have the follow-up by program officers via phone, via WhatsApp.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That is what I could answer for the first question. What regular activity has been, have community groups, community leaders represented, been able to continue.
Okay. Well, they've only given me a few minutes for this discussion. Let me turn to someone else. Thank you, Pascal. Yeah. That was great.
Thank you.
So, can someone else share about what aspects or what activities of your regular community mobilization programming have been able to continue, and what
about
aspects have not
we
worked.
hear from Arthur next?
Great, Arthur, let's hear from you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Arthur. I'm the country director for Core Africa in Malawi. Thank you very much for having me on this call. Let me first start off by just talking about the first question, which was the regular activities that community groups, councils, and leaders have been able to continue. Through the chapter, in talking to different organizations, the activities that have been able to be continued or resumed are mainly the community meetings. Community meetings are continuing, such as church gatherings. There are some health centers that are currently not operational in some areas because there's lack of protective equipment. However, we have heard from other organizations, such as private sector as well, that community development like activities such as road maintenance and construction of teachers' houses, for example, are still continuing. Health extension workers in government are still continuing to work in some areas, and also social workers are still conducting activities. One of the things that we have also been trying to do, let me just talk about the organization I'm with, Core Africa, is really just to support the work of the individuals that are in the communities. And thank you to Anne, who shared on the Malawi chapter a message that came from our ambassador from Malawi, who is based in DC, just congratulating all the volunteers that have been in the communities working tirelessly with community members to encourage them and to continue to support activities that they're doing amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And so looking on a broader aspect, we've talked to various other volunteering organizations such as VSO. As you know, Peace Corps is no longer in Malawi since COVID-19 came in. So we're trying to look at how can we continue to sensitize communities. And through the collaboration of other organizations, we have seen that this is the response that we're getting. Lastly, John, I'd just like to mention that as the Malawi chapter, we're also stepping into another gear where we are looking at engaging with the national COVID response team so that we can do a COVID-19 resilience community communication through various media with various stakeholders such as the NGOs, civil society, donors, private philanthropy, and government. We are planning on having this in the month of June, so I'm just talking ahead of time. So hopefully that we can have churches involved and get the message out through various media channels. Let me stop there.
Very good. Okay, well, I think, unless I'm mistaken, I think that's all the time we have for this bit. Let me introduce that we're about to go into breakout groups.
I think we are getting, most people are on their way back now. I hope that was a fruitful conversation. I know in hours we, of course, did not have quite enough time. I'm going to give it a few minutes to let everybody come back in here, not a few minutes, a few seconds, I'll say, to let people come back. Okay. So now I'm going to turn it over to the reporters from each of the 4 breakout groups. Hopefully someone took notes from each one. I'm just going to give you about 2 minutes each. So again, apologies if we cut you short, but hopefully there were note takers in all the sessions and we'll include it in the summaries. So does someone from the first group on access want to speak? I don't know, John and Robin, whoever you nominated or whoever nominated themselves.
We actually didn't do that part. So Robin and I can share, but it was a rich discussion. I think the what people saw was a lot of community activities were continuing, both regular kinds of activities such as community kitchens in Venezuela or sending food home with kids to their families were able to continue because the community leaders were there. one of the, in this first question, how do you support them? A real important point was made of kind of the emotional and sometimes financial support of the community leaders, because people are turning to them, needing things, wanting things from their community leaders that they maybe can't provide. And that, Robin, do you want to share any other parts of the work that came out? You can see in their tiny print here. Oh,
sure. I think one of the examples I really liked about adapting was from Venezuela. I believe it was Guillermo who shared about how, first of all, in Venezuela, they were already dealing with a humanitarian crisis before COVID hit, and that they had already developed a reliance on the informal economy, which has made this even more challenging because of that high reliance on the informal economy. And that one of the adaptations they've done is where they already had community kitchens run out of people's homes, that they have self-imposed physical distancing measures in those homes, recognizing that it's a small space, and now letting only a few people in at a time, or having children actually pick up the food and take it back to their own homes. So I thought that was a really great example.
great. That's probably our 2.5 minutes at least.
Sorry.
Perfect. No, that was really helpful. From the second group on convening, I think Chris is going to give a quick overview, and apologies, we had some technical trouble with our sheet, so our comments are a little bit messy looking, but they're there. I'm going to mute everyone, and then Chris, you can just unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I think like two big themes emerged from our group on convening. The first one was that there's a lot of work still to be done on actually just getting the word out on the pandemic coronavirus and what's actually going on, especially in rural areas. There's a lot of talk from our group in programming in Nigeria, where people really aren't seeing the actual effects of the coronavirus because it hasn't impacted their community in rural areas, and they only see that things are closed and they're wanting to get back to normal. And we know that that's not the best direction to go. And so a lot of the CDD and CLD programming in those areas is still focused on getting the word out and also providing like direct like health relief, like masks, sanitizers, hand washing stations. There's also examples in our group from Mexico where CLD and CDD programming is actually making sure that the government relief supplies and benefits are actually being delivered to communities, especially those communities that are harder to reach. The second theme on convening was modifying CLD and CDD programming, especially through empowering community members through cell phones, make sure they're checking in on each other, but also prioritizing different programming, especially those like based around health and gender-based violence, where there really still is a need to do some kind of programming, even though people can't convene.
Thank you, Chris. Now over to the third group on procurement and service delivery, just 2 minutes.
So I don't believe we also found someone to report. So I will quickly, we heard some of the same issues in northern Nigeria, specifically around, or actually across Nigeria, around gaps in information. So we were looking at procurement and service delivery, but we also heard about information flows, still needing to move forward with more information about the virus to overcome some of the ideas that people have, so that they will take it more seriously. We heard a lot about borders and truckers and people not being able to move freely, which will then impede the flow of goods into countries. On the other hand, we heard a lot of really good adaptations about people making sure that government resources that are allocated are reaching the people at the local level, holding local authorities accountable, and then having Zoom meetings, having some meetings in person, but with appropriate physical distancing, and also being alert to the fact that FGM and other forms of violence are increasing if shelters need to close down, and mapping and doing research on the needs of people, and doing that rapid research and holding and then using the results to implement programming. And I think, yeah, so we heard a little bit about also some schools reopening partially, and efforts that are being made in Kenya where the government has imposed a very serious lockdown, and really just following the lead of the government and working closely with local and national authorities. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And then very quickly from the fourth group on shifting time and shifting priorities.
This is Anne, nominated by my group because no one else wanted to do it, so that's totally understandable. Shifting priorities. So there's obviously projects that are underway and programs that are underway, and the number one problem is lockdown. Conditions vary a lot across countries. The places where the lockdown is happening, the main issues are food and livelihoods. And with food, the issues are hunger and also nutrition, and then also trying to look ahead with regards to keeping people's immune systems strong should COVID hit their countries. Another way of breaking it down was in health, non-health, and other. So the health, obviously, COVID hasn't hit hard in many of these places, but there is a mental health issue and there's violence. And then from the non-health, it's mostly the food security and the livelihoods. And then the other is things that are going on like a flood in DRC with a lot of displaced people and crops ruined. So the regular work that we're doing and issues that will come up. Looking ahead to the future, it's just unclear what's going to happen. And so one of the biggest sort of things happening now is this idea about trying to figure out about communication methods, including where there is no internet, using the phone, the possibility of small group meetings when that's okay and according to protocols. Getting the data from the communities and then also getting information to the communities. So it does, much of the disruption really just has to do with the conditions of lockdown mostly at this point.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, we are a little bit short on time as anything. So I wanted to quickly, Diana mentioned this at the beginning about the draft reflections paper that we shared yesterday. Again, it's a draft and very much hope you'll all submit some other takeaways or feedback on it so it can reflect all of our reflections. In it, as she mentioned, there were two initial thoughts on how COVID could be an opportunity. It's obviously a very hard challenge, but also perhaps an opportunity for some collective introspection on how to generally make CLD programming more resilient and stronger and better prepared for either the next wave of COVID, as we know it could be with us for a long time, or another kind of crisis that also requires social distancing or government shutdowns or similar kinds of barriers. So we're going to put up on the screen, John, if you don't mind, a couple of questions for us to have a quick discussion about. And again, please, everybody, put in your responses into the chat box and raise your hand. The more, the better. But they all are around these sort of two themes that Diana mentioned. The first is, should we be integrating crisis preparation into our regular CLD programming moving forward? That means, should it be part of our trainings? Should it be part of community planning? Should it be part of resource allocation? The things that we would do if there weren't a global crisis. And the second question that we have for all of you comes from the fact that this experience has been a reminder for a lot of us about how much of our processes rely on having people come into communities, again, for training, for facilitation, for M&E, monitoring and evaluation. So should we be learning anything about how we can transfer those kinds of roles and those kinds of functions to communities better and ultimately make our own processes more community-led? So I think, John, yep, we have the discussion questions up, and I will hand over to John for us to reflect for a few minutes. John, I think you're muted. Yep, you're muted, John. Huh. Oh, I'm unmuting you. There you go.
Oh, okay. Yes, I was clicking at the same time because I have to move from the slide. Okay, so yeah, I think this, these questions of how we can build back better, how can we integrate this kind of planning. I got word last night from our colleagues, for example, in Bangladesh and India, that the largest ever recorded cyclone is hitting them today, both in Orissa and West Bengal. And so, disasters triggered by climate, triggered by disease, that kind of thing is going to be always part of life. And so we wanted to really, since we're in this crisis, we can learn from it and plan in it. So who would like to either in the chat window or raise your hand and make a contribution to this larger discussion? Did you want to, I hear someone's speaking. Did you want to speak to this question?
Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
This is Jude from Liberia. Hello?
Yes, we hear you. Go ahead.
So I want to answer some of the questions posted here.
Yes.
So right presently, we have been doing what we call community awareness here in Liberia, and especially in our community, we're trying to encourage and educate people to keep on the social distance, which are very, very important. And we are trying to map out the 17 districts here in Liberia, try to train community leaders, district leaders, and volunteer support and responding and staff to be able to teach and educate our people more about this pandemic diseases, even now and the one that will arise in the near future. So these are most of the things we have been doing. But right now, our government are not supporting the CSOs. Everything we're doing it voluntarily because we love our community and then we love our people. So right now we're still working towards that, and we are hoping to commence the training, the H2P training to our people, so that everybody will be aware of what to do in terms of epidemic crisis like this. So I'm very much happy to be attending this meeting and be part of this meeting, be part of the MCLD globally. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And it's great to have Liberia with us today. Anyone else looking to the future and the necessity to really build this kind of planning and resilience capacity into every community? What are people thinking? What are people seeing? Tomei has written into the chat box, business re-engineering is more based on digitalization, mobile money, etc., agricultural value chains, and adopting community-managed disaster risk reduction, which was used for the common, oops, now it floated by. But anyway, integrated disaster risk reduction into regular programming. And then there's a note from, we must observe and be very careful not to break down the evident local leadership in action.
Oops. John, can you speak a little closer to the mic? Sorry.
It's right in my mouth. Are you hearing it? Or if not, you can read from the, you can take over and read from the chat window.
I think we hear you better now. Or Anne can.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so Deanna points out that we have to be careful not to break the dynamics that evidence local leadership in action. The solutions must emerge from communities and accompanied by CBOs leading towards the solution. Our awareness must be alert now that we know our role is to accompany and catalyze solutions. So obviously we're proponents of community-led development, but now it's way harder than ever to be in touch and to even physically be with them. So how can we adapt and accommodate? We heard from Spark Uganda that they have some new sort of ways of communicating that they're putting into place so that they're getting data, collecting data, and hearing from the communities. I wonder if, let's see, Anne Wahinya. Oh, it's always nice to see your name. Would you like to, I will unmute you. I have the power. Go ahead, Anne. Let's hear from you.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's very, very important that moving forward in our programming, we do prepare communities. We do need to think of community resilience, how to respond to emergencies, because it has literally, for example, back here, even local organizations and even INGOs, it has taken quite some time for them to start, knowing how to respond. No one had put aside any monies for this kind of crisis. The only emergency kitty, for example, we have back here is usually for drought. Usually, when there's drought, then there's some food emergency funds that are in place, or when we have floods. So this was very unprecedented. It took even quite some time for the chapter members, because the first thing organizations did is, people were sent home to work from home. So most people have lost some of them have lost their jobs. And the communities, even they were disrupted, even the way they look for their sources of income. People who travel, for example, if you live in Nairobi, work in another place, it's very difficult because we have these situations. But then, so moving forward, we have to see how do communities prepare for other crises like this. But right now, even for us, we've had, even the government response is a bit wanting, because the other day we had the government sort of like demolish houses at night for some of the people, and it's during this in the middle of an epidemic. So it's the situation is quite worrying. So even when we usually meet and trying to figure out how do you prepare communities, I think we really need moving forward to make sure that this is always in our conversations, in our discussions, so that it's also community-led and owned, and the discussions start from the ground. By the time we are coming to respond to it, right now the responses are reactionary. It is, like now it's supporting people to like make masks, distribute them, food, but it's more of a reaction. So it has taken time, like for us to tell communities, now it's time, we need to take charge of this situation. Yeah.
Very
Thank you, Anne. And I do see your comments are reinforced by other comments in the chat box. I'll really encourage everyone to look at those comments because they're really important. And maybe one of the most important themes is we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So communities need to be prepared. And what does it mean to be prepared with this kind of new level of awareness? There's issues of savings, there's issues of food, there's issues of ability to share correct information at the local level from trusted sources, avoiding the fake news, trying to figure out how to sort of collaborate and work with the government, but also take independent action. And then there is a note from Pat from Ohio. You know, the US has been so hard hit, and hopefully other countries will not be so hard hit, but if it hits hard anywhere else, you're going to wish you'd been better prepared, and communities will wish they'd been better prepared because it is really, really serious. So, you know, if we just think about general community preparedness with all kinds of disasters, it doesn't have to be only about COVID. Sort of how can you go wrong in the face of this reality? I wonder if there's there's some other hands raised. And Nellie, do we have time to hear from someone else or?
Yeah, I saw Guillermo put a comment in there, and Paul. I think it'd be great to quickly hear from them.
Okay, yes, so we have Guillermo's comments. We should pin down possible strategies for the possibility of future crises. Health prevention and climate change should definitely be on the table. Nevertheless, it should be a process of plural discussion and dialogue, echoing Anne's comment. As organizations, we need to continuously learn from the people we work with, but also we can function as bridges of valuable information and success stories of other parts of the world, such as the ones we've been discussing in the meeting. We also heard from Yosi Maton from Plateau State, Nigeria, and moving forward also says we need to adopt disaster management into regular programming. COVID-19 might not be the last global crisis. Personally believe in developing communities, helping them to be more self-sufficient, supporting them in advancement that does not have them completely reliant on foreign aid. The government was unprepared. I think some of us from some countries know what it's like to feel that our government was unprepared. And in that case, you know, you gotta be ready with plan B. People need to be self-sufficient. Also, the Movement for Community-Led Development in Nigeria will need to explore how to leverage farmers for a good harvest at the end of the season. Issues of lockdown and the movement of trucks is affecting many, many countries, and the idea for value change that are internal to countries is also an important issue that's coming up as well.
Great,
I apologize if I missed your comments because there are some more comments, but we will definitely take all of them and make sure we share them.
Yeah.
Okay. So Nellie, should we go back to the poll now?
Sure.
Because I think there's a real question of, there were discussion of working groups, and I know we sent that out in the email. And so we wanted to bring back the poll and see if people now feel differently about joining working groups, or what kind, how we should organize to work on these issues. So
Great, I'm attempting to.
I gotta stop sharing first.
I don't know. I'm attempting to launch the poll. It might not work, but it says there's an error, but that's okay. I think people can type into the response box whether we want to pursue a working group on this topic. We could either pursue multiple working groups on the different barriers, or one working group that tackles a few. We could stick with a meeting like this every few months or something, or maybe once a month or more. Or maybe we think that actually we need to focus just on other parts of our work, and we can share resources, but we don't need to continue on with these meetings. So if people, I will attempt again to launch the poll, but if you don't mind just typing into the chat box what you think we should do, that would be great.
It's not launching, you mean?
No, it's not launching, but it's okay. If people don't mind just typing into the chat box what they would like to do. And then John, I think you can wrap up. We only have a couple of minutes left.
Okay. So please do type it in. Once again, we will be digesting all this and sharing it as both a digest and details on the website and recordings on the website. And I really want to thank everybody for being here. We had 50 people on the line, plus I think in a few places there were multiple people on one line. So I really appreciate, and it was really moving to hear the kinds of committed support that all of you are providing to communities. And it's definitely the commitment of this movement that become available for everybody everywhere. So our advocacy and sharing what we've learned is going to be very important in catalyzing that big shift around the world. So I want to thank Nelly and Gunjan and everybody who prepared today's call, and all of you for bringing kind of the experience of this past month of doing community-led development in the time of COVID to the call. And with that, thank you for anything else, Nelly, from you?
Yes, just a couple of quick reminders. The Excel documents that we all worked on today will still be open for the next about 2 weeks. And so people can continue to input into them. Please do. Please also send any comments on the reflections paper in the next week by May 24th. Actually, in the next 4 days, excuse me. And then there'll be a second installment of the reflections paper coming in a couple of weeks. And to reiterate, John, thank you so much. Thank you to those who are putting into the chat box about next steps and where to go from here. And we look forward to continuing to come up with adaptations and seeing how to make our programming stronger for the immediate and the long term. Thank you all so much.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes, please.
Maybe we'll leave this connected for the next 10 minutes to give everyone a chance to put their chats in the chat box. Anything that came up for you during this meeting or response to the last query, it's so valuable to us. So just type away and we will be glad to hear from you.
That's a great idea. Please do that. Thanks, Anne. Bye. I see people waving.
Bye.
Thanks for joining all. Bye.